The Peterson family dinner party had always been a sanctimonious affair. Every third Sunday, without fail, Daniel's mother Helen would summon the clan to her immaculate colonial in Oakwood Hills, where 3 generations would gather around her antique mahogany table to perform the ritual of familial harmony. 28 sterling place settings, 28 starched napkins, 28 performances of contentment. I had endured these dinners for 15 years of marriage, smiling through Helen's subtle critiques of my parenting, nodding through Daniel's father's political monologues, deflecting questions about when Daniel would finally make partner at his law firm. My husband would squeeze my knee under the table when tensions rose, a silent plea for patience that I always granted. Until today. Today, the Tiffany blue envelope burned in my purse like contraband. Inside, a hotel receipt from the Lankham downtown, dated last Tuesday, a day Daniel had supposedly been in Cleveland for a deposition. The receipt showed room service for 2, a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, and a late checkout, all charged to the corporate card he thought I couldn't access. It wasn't the first evidence I'd gathered over the past 3 months. There were the unexplained charges at jewelry stores where I'd received no gifts, the late nights that stretched beyond any reasonable court proceeding, the scent of unfamiliar perfume, faint but distinctive, on shirts I was told, had picked up smells from restaurants. But it was the receipt that broke me. Not because it confirmed what I already knew, but because of the date. Last Tuesday wasn't just any Tuesday. It was our daughter Sophie's piano recital, the one Daniel had heartbreakingly missed due to the unavoidable deposition in Cleveland. As I took my seat at Helen's table now, the weight of secrets pressed against my ribs. Daniel sat across from me, handsome in his casual Sunday sweater, laughing at something his brother had said. He looked so at ease, so entitled to his double life. Beside him, his mother beamed with pride at her firstborn son, blissfully unaware that her perfect family portrait was about to be shattered. Sophie, 12 years old and still glowing from her recital triumph, sat to my right, while our 10-year-old son, Ethan, fidgeted on my left. They deserved better than this charade. We all did. I hadn't planned to do it here. I hadn't planned to do it at all, really. I'd contemplated quiet divorce filings, dignified separations, private confrontations. But when Helen raised her crystal glass and announced, "A toast to Daniel for securing the Westridge account, the biggest in the firm's history," something inside me snapped. My hand moved to my purse. The envelope. The truth. It was time. "To Daniel," everyone echoed, glasses rising in unison. My hand stilled on my purse as 28 pairs of eyes turned expectantly toward my husband. Daniel stood, straightening his shoulders with practiced confidence. "Thank you, everyone." The Westridge account was certainly challenging, but as I've always said, persistence pays off. He smiled that perfect smile that had once made my heart race. I couldn't have done it without the support of my wonderful wife, who understands the sacrifices necessary for success. He raised his glass in my direction, his eyes meeting mine with such convincing warmth that for a split second, I questioned everything I knew. This was his gift, making you doubt your own reality. "To Rebecca," he added, "the most understanding wife a man could ask for." The room murmured appreciatively. Daniel's sister-in-law, Jen, caught my eye from across the table and gave me a sympathetic smile. She, at least, had always seen through the performative nature of these gatherings. "Speech, Rebecca!" called Uncle Warren from the far end of the table, always eager to extend these rituals. All eyes turned to me. In 15 years, I had never refused this particular custom, the adoring wife expressing pride in her accomplished husband. I had the script memorized. Gratitude for his hard work, admiration for his dedication, some self-deprecating joke about managing the household while he conquered the professional world. But today, the words wouldn't come. "Rebecca?" Daniel prompted, a hint of concern creeping into his expression. He knew me well enough to sense when something was off. "I'm afraid I didn't prepare anything," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "But I do have something to share." Daniel's smile faltered slightly. Beside me, Sophie straightened in her seat, always attentive to shifts in mood. My fingers found the envelope in my purse, but I hesitated. The children. They were watching, innocent witnesses to whatever came next. Was this the right moment? The right setting? "Mom?" Sophie whispered, sensing my internal conflict. I released the envelope, letting it remain hidden. "Actually, I'd like to propose a different toast," I said, rising to my feet. "To family honesty, to integrity, to keeping our promises." Confusion rippled around the table. Helen's perfectly penciled eyebrows drew together. "Well, that's certainly admirable, Rebecca," she said. her tone suggesting she found my toast peculiar but was too polite to say so. Daniel's expression had darkened, uncertainty clouding his features. He knew me too well. 15 years of marriage had given him an acute awareness of my moods, just as it had given me the ability to recognize when he was lying. "To honesty," Daniel echoed cautiously, raising his glass again. The rest of the family followed suit, though the enthusiasm had noticeably dimmed. As everyone sipped their drinks, Daniel's father attempted to redirect the conversation. "Sophie, tell us about your piano recital. Your grandmother says you played beautifully." Sophie brightened. "I played Debussy's Clair de Lune. Dad missed it because he was in Cleveland, but Mom recorded it. Want to see?" "I'd love to," Helen replied, always indulgent with her grandchildren. "Actually," Daniel interjected smoothly, "perhaps after dinner would be better for videos. Mom's roast is getting cold." But Sophie, with a child's innocent persistence, was already pulling up the video on my phone, which I'd handed to her without thinking. "Look, Grandma," she said proudly, turning the screen toward Helen. "This was right before I went on stage. Mom took a picture of everyone who came. The image showed our family and friends gathered in the recital hall. Sophie's piano teacher, my parents, several neighbors, Ethan holding flowers for his sister." "Where were you seated, Daniel?" Helen asked innocently. "I don't see you in the photo." The question hung in the air, a tiny fissure in the perfect facade. "As Sophie mentioned, Daniel couldn't attend," I said, each word deliberate. "He was in Cleveland, for a deposition, for the Westridge account." Daniel's eyes locked with mine across the table, a silent warning I chose to ignore. "It was unavoidable," he said firmly. "These things happen in corporate law. Sometimes sacrifices are necessary." The word sacrifices ignited something in me. Sophie's disappointed face that night, the lie told so effortlessly. The years of similar deceptions stacked like cordwood. My hand returned to my purse, fingers closing around the envelope. "Sacrifices," I repeated. "Yes, let's talk about those." The dining room air grew heavy with unspoken tension. Helen, ever the vigilant guardian of family harmony, attempted to redirect the conversation. "The roast really is getting cold," she announced, signaling to her husband to begin carving. "Daniel, perhaps you could open another bottle of the Cabernet?" But Daniel remained seated, his eyes fixed on my hand as it emerged from my purse, the blue envelope now visible to everyone. "What's that, Mom?" Ethan asked, innocent curiosity in his voice. For the first time, I faltered. My children's presence had momentarily slipped from my consciousness in the rush of righteous anger. They were watching, absorbing, interpreting. Whatever happened next would shape their understanding of marriage, of honesty, of how adults handle betrayal. "It's something your father and I need to discuss," I said carefully. "Perhaps later would be better." I began to return the envelope to my purse, a temporary retreat for the children's sake. Daniel's shoulders relaxed visibly, mistaking my hesitation for surrender. That's when Sophie spoke, her voice small but clear. "Is it about Dad not really being in Cleveland?" The table fell silent. Daniel's face drained of color. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Helen asked, looking between her granddaughter and son with confusion. Sophie shrugged, suddenly self-conscious with all eyes on her. "I tried calling Dad before my recital, to tell him I was nervous, but his phone wasn't in Cleveland. The map app showed he was downtown, at a hotel." The innocence of her technological savvy, this generation that grew up tracking family members on smartphones without thinking twice, created a moment of startled silence. "Sophie," Daniel began, his lawyer voice emerging, reasonable, authoritative, designed to create doubt. "The phone location isn't always accurate, and I've told you before about checking my location without asking. But I did ask," Sophie countered, a tremor in her voice. "You told me I could call anytime I was nervous. You promised." The word "promised" hung in the air, weighted with accusation. I looked at my daughter's face, so earnest, so trusting despite the first cracks of doubt, and made a decision. This wasn't about humiliating Daniel in front of his family. This wasn't about my wounded pride or shattered trust. This was about teaching my children that truth matters, that promises should be kept, that actions have consequences. "Sophie," I said gently, "why don't you take Ethan to the den? I think there's a new nature documentary Grandpa recorded. We'll call you when dessert is ready." Sophie's eyes, so like her father's, studied my face. At 12, she was perceptive enough to recognize adult evasion, but she nodded slowly. "Come on, Ethan," she said, taking her brother's hand. "I bet it's the one about penguins." Once the children had left, the adults sat in uncomfortable silence. Daniel's brother Mark cleared his throat. Maybe we should give them some privacy. No, I said firmly. You're all here because family matters to you, because honesty and integrity matter. At least that's what we've always claimed. I placed the envelope on the table but didn't open it. Daniel wasn't in Cleveland last Tuesday. He was at the Langham downtown with a woman named Christina Lawson. She's a junior associate at the firm. This isn't the first time, and she's not the first woman. The shock that rippled through the room was palpable. Helen's hand flew to her throat, a gesture so melodramatic it might have been comical under different circumstances. Rebecca, Daniel's voice had an edge of desperate authority. You're making a scene based on some misunderstanding. Whatever you think you know, I know exactly what's been happening. I cut him off, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. I've known for months, the Landry girl before Christina, the unexplained charges, the late nights, the weekends, at the office. Daniel's father, Richard, who had remained silent until now, set down his carving knife with deliberate care. Son, is this true? Daniel looked around the table, at the faces of his family, his mother's shock, his father's disappointment, his brother's awkward discomfort, his sister-in-law's quiet vindication. Finally, his eyes returned to me. Not here, he said through clenched teeth. We can discuss this privately. Like you discussed missing our daughter's recital to be with your girlfriend? I asked, my voice finally betraying emotion. No, I don't think so, not anymore. I opened the envelope. The receipt inside was unremarkable in its appearance. Standard hotel stationery, itemized charges, a signature at the bottom. But as I removed it from the envelope, its power transformed the room. It was no longer just paper and ink. It was incontrovertible evidence, a physical manifestation of betrayal. I didn't immediately pass it around or read it aloud. Instead, I placed it in the center of the table, visible to anyone who cared to look. The quiet action carried more weight than any dramatic gesture could have. Daniel stared at the receipt, his expression shifting from denial to recognition. He knew exactly what it contained. The Langham, I said quietly. Room 1214. Last Tuesday from 4 p.m. until the late checkout at 2 p.m. Wednesday. Room service dinner for 2. Champagne, breakfast. I paused, letting the implications sink in. All while Sophie played Debussy, thinking her father was in another state on important business. Helen reached for the receipt with trembling fingers, social propriety momentarily forgotten in the face of such revelations. She studied it, then passed it wordlessly to Richard, whose face had hardened into an expression I'd never seen before. Christina Lawson, I continued, 28 years old, graduated from Northwestern Law 2 years ago. Joined the firm last year, specializes in corporate tax law. How did you... Daniel began, then stopped, realizing the question itself was an admission. Credit card statements, I replied matter-of-factly. Email receipts, the Find My Phone app that Sophie used. It wasn't particularly difficult, Daniel. You've gotten careless, or perhaps you simply thought I wouldn't look. The silence that followed was interrupted only by the sound of Richard carefully folding the receipt and placing it back on the table. His movements were precise, controlled, belying the emotion evident in his eyes. I raised you better than this, he said finally, his voice thick with disappointment. Daniel flinched as if struck. His father's approval had always been the currency he valued most. More than money, more than professional success, certainly more than his marriage vows. Dad, it's not... Daniel stopped himself, the reflexive denial dying on his lips. Even he couldn't bring himself to lie directly in the face of such evidence. Helen had begun to cry silently, perfect mascara tracks mapping her distress. What about the children? She whispered. What about your family? It was the quintessential Helen question, concerned less with the moral failing than with its impact on the family's image and stability. Yet for once I found myself in agreement with her focus, if not her motivation. What about the children? What about Sophie, who had tried to reach her father in a moment of vulnerability, only to discover the first of what would likely be many adult deceptions? The children are why I'm doing this, I said, addressing Helen directly. They deserve better than a household built on lies. They deserve to understand that integrity isn't just something we talk about at Sunday dinner. It's how we live when no one is watching, or when we think no one is watching. Daniel's brother Mark, who had remained uncomfortably silent throughout the revelation, finally spoke. Maybe we should give you two some privacy to discuss this. No, Daniel said sharply. This isn't... He stopped, regrouped. Rebecca is upset, understandably. but she's making assumptions based on partial information. I laughed then, a sound so unexpected in the tense atmosphere that everyone started. Partial information? What part am I missing, Daniel? The part where you explain that you were conducting a deposition in a hotel room with champagne? The part where you justify why your girlfriend's lipstick keeps appearing on your collar? Or maybe the part where you explain the earring I found in your car last month, the one that wasn't mine. Daniel's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. This isn't appropriate dinner conversation. Neither is adultery, Richard responded, his voice granite. Yet here we are. Daniel turned to his father, clearly shocked by the lack of paternal support. Dad, you don't understand the pressures I'm under. The hours, the expectations at the firm. Don't, Richard cut him off. Don't insult me by suggesting that professional pressure justifies betraying your wife and lying to your children. I built my practice from nothing, worked 80-hour weeks for decades, and never once used that as an excuse to dishonor your mother. The rebuke landed with devastating precision. Daniel, always the golden child in his father's eyes, seemed to physically diminish under the weight of his disapproval. Helen, recovering her composure slightly, reached across the table toward me. Rebecca, dear, perhaps we should take a breath. These matters are complex. Marriage has its difficulties. With counseling, with time, with respect, Helen, I interrupted, withdrawing my hand from her reach. This isn't a momentary lapse or a single indiscretion. This has been happening for over a year, with multiple women. This is who your son has chosen to be. Daniel's head snapped up. A year? You've known for a year? The question revealed more than he intended. Not denial, but surprise at the duration of my awareness. In that moment, everyone at the table understood that he wasn't contesting the truth of my accusations, merely the timeline of my knowledge. Not for the entire year, no, I clarified, maintaining a composure that felt almost out of body in its steadiness. I had suspicions last fall when the late nights became routine, but I trusted you. I made excuses for you. I convinced myself that my doubts were just insecurity. I looked around the table at the faces of the family I had been part of for 15 years. Helen's carefully maintained appearance now crumbling around the edges, Richard's stoic disappointment, Mark's uncomfortable avoidance, Jen's quiet solidarity. Then in February, I found the first concrete evidence, a hotel receipt much like this one that had been left in your suit jacket. The Remington downtown. You told me you were working late at the office. That was Jessica Miller, wasn't it? The litigation associate? Daniel's silence was confirmation enough. I confronted you then, I continued, addressing Daniel directly now, as if the others had faded from the room. You remember? I asked if there was something going on. If you were unhappy in our marriage. You looked me in the eye and said I was being paranoid, that I should trust you, that 15 years and 2 children deserved better than baseless accusations. The memory of that conversation, his righteous indignation, my subsequent self-doubt, fueled my resolve to finish what I had started. So I did what you suggested. I looked for concrete evidence before making accusations. I checked the credit card statements. I reviewed your emails when you left your laptop open. I installed location tracking on our family phone plan. Daniel's expression shifted from embarrassment to anger. You spied on me? I verified what I already knew. I corrected him. And yes, I waited. I waited to see if it was truly a pattern and not a mistake. I waited to see if you would come clean on your own. I waited because ending a 15-year marriage and disrupting our children's lives isn't something I take lightly. Helen, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, found her voice again. If you've known for months, why bring this up now? Why here, at a family dinner? It was a fair question, one I had asked myself repeatedly on the drive over. The answer emerged with surprising clarity. Because nothing was changing, I said simply. Because Daniel was becoming more reckless, not less. Because the lies were piling up, affecting not just me but the children. I paused, looking directly at my mother-in-law. And because this family has a pattern of prioritizing appearances over authenticity, of burying uncomfortable truths rather than addressing them. Helen recoiled slightly, recognizing the implicit criticism of the Peterson family culture she had so carefully cultivated. A culture where unpleasantness was handled privately, where public faces rarely matched private realities. What exactly are you hoping to accomplish with this disclosure? She asked, her voice strained but still clinging to propriety. Before I could answer, Richard spoke up. She's holding my son accountable, Helen. Something we should have done more of ourselves. He turned to me, his expression somber but respectful. What do you need from us, Rebecca? The question caught me off guard. In all my scenarios for how this confrontation might unfold, I hadn't anticipated such direct support from Daniel's father. It momentarily disrupted the script I had been following. I began, then paused to gather my thoughts. I need everyone to understand that what happens next isn't impulsive or vindictive. It's a considered response to repeated betrayal. And what is happening next? Daniel asked, his lawyer's instinct for getting ahead of damaging information finally kicking in. I met his gaze steadily. I've already consulted with an attorney. I'll be filing for divorce this week. I've documented everything. The affairs, the financial deceptions, the neglect of family obligations. I'm not interested in a public spectacle, but I am interested in a fair settlement and a custody arrangement that prioritizes the children's well-being. The clinical precision of my plan seemed to affect Daniel more than any emotional outburst could have. The color drained from his face as he realized I wasn't just reacting in the heat of the moment. I had been strategizing, preparing, building a case with the same methodical care he would use for a high-stakes client. You can't just decide this unilaterally, he protested, but the argument sounded hollow even to his own ears. I'm not deciding our divorce unilaterally, I corrected him. You decided that with each deliberate choice you made. I'm simply acknowledging the reality you created. Mark cleared his throat awkwardly. Maybe we should check on the kids. The mention of Sophie and Ethan brought a sudden, sobering awareness back to the room. They were just beyond the dining room, temporarily distracted by penguins, but undoubtedly sensing the tension that had engulfed the adults. Yes, I agreed, shifting focus. They should be told something, though not everything. Not yet. As Mark rose to go to the den, Daniel made a move to follow him. I caught his arm. Not you, I said firmly. Not until we agree on what they should hear. They deserve a unified message, even if everything else between us is fractured. For the first time, genuine regret flickered across Daniel's features, not just for being caught, but perhaps for what his actions had set in motion. I never wanted to hurt them, he said quietly. I believe that, I replied, surprised to find I actually did. But intentions don't erase consequences. They're going to be hurt. The question now is how we minimize the damage and help them understand that none of this is their fault. Mark returned with the children, who entered the dining room with visible apprehension. Sophie's eyes immediately darted between Daniel and me, assessing the situation with a perceptiveness beyond her years. Ethan, less attuned to adult undercurrents, was mainly concerned with whether dessert would still be served. Is everything okay? Sophie asked, her voice small but direct. I exchanged a glance with Daniel, silently negotiating how much to share in this moment. To my surprise, he deferred to me with a slight nod. Sophie, Ethan, I began, choosing my words carefully. Dad and I need to talk to you about some changes that will be happening in our family. Helen made a small noise of protest, clearly uncomfortable with addressing such matters in front of everyone, but Richard quieted her with a gentle touch on her arm. What kind of changes? Ethan asked, anxiety creeping into his voice. At 10, any disruption to routine registered as a potential catastrophe. I moved to stand between my children, placing a reassuring hand on each of their shoulders. Dad and I have been having some problems in our marriage, I explained, keeping my tone even. We've decided that we need to live separately for a while. Sophie's eyes immediately filled with tears, while Ethan looked confused. Like a divorce? He asked bluntly. I nodded, not sugarcoating the reality. Yes, like a divorce. But I want you both to understand something very important. This is an adult problem that has nothing to do with either of you. Dad and I both love you more than anything in the world, and that will never change. Daniel finally found his voice, moving to kneel in front of the children. Your mom is right. This isn't your fault, and nothing about how much we love you is changing. Sophie, always quick to connect dots, looked at him with surprising directness. Is this because you weren't really in Cleveland? Because you were at a hotel instead of my recital? The innocent precision of her question created a palpable tension in the room. Daniel visibly struggled for a response that wouldn't be an outright lie, but wouldn't burden his daughter with the full truth either. Sophie, he finally said, I made some bad choices that hurt your mom's feelings and broke her trust. Missing your recital was one of those bad choices, and I'm truly sorry for that. But why were you at a hotel downtown instead of in Cleveland? She persisted, the natural inquisitiveness of a 12-year-old cutting through adult evasions. Before Daniel could formulate a response, I intervened. Sophie, sometimes adults make complicated mistakes that are hard to explain to children. The important thing right now isn't exactly what happened, but how we move forward in a way that's healthy for everyone. Sophie studied my face, then her father's, absorbing more than either of us probably realized. "Are you moving out, Dad?" she asked, her practical nature asserting itself through the emotion. Daniel looked to me again, and I nodded slightly, confirming the plan we had never actually discussed, but that seemed inevitable. "Yes," he answered softly. "I'll be staying at the Residence Inn for a little while until I find an apartment nearby, but I'll still see you all the time. We'll work out a schedule so you know exactly when you'll be with me and when you'll be with Mom." Ethan, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly burst into tears. "I don't want you to go," he cried, throwing himself at Daniel with such force that Daniel nearly lost his balance. The raw emotion broke through the careful control I had maintained throughout the confrontation. Tears burned behind my eyes as I watched my son cling to his father, his small body shaking with sobs. This was the real cost of Daniel's betrayal, not my wounded pride or trust, but this fundamental fracturing of our children's sense of security and family. Helen, never able to bear her grandchildren's distress, moved to comfort Ethan, but I gently intercepted her. "It's okay," I said quietly. "He needs this moment with his dad." As Daniel held our son, murmuring reassurances, Sophie slipped her hand into mine. "Did you know?" she whispered. "When you came to my recital? Did you know Dad was lying?" The question pierced my heart. How much truth did I owe my daughter? How much should I protect her from? "I suspected something wasn't right," I admitted finally. "But I came to your recital focused only on you, Sophie, on how proud I am of you. Nothing else mattered in that moment." She nodded, seeming to accept this partial truth. "Will we be okay?" she asked, the question containing layers of meaning beyond her years. I pulled her close, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Yes," I promised. "Different, but okay. Sometimes things have to break before they can heal properly." Across the room, Richard caught my eye over the heads of his wife and grandchildren. His expression conveyed a complex mixture of regret, respect, and resolve. With a slight nod, he communicated his support, not just for my decision to end the marriage, but for the way I was handling this impossible moment with the children. In that silent exchange, I felt a surprising sense of connection with my father-in-law that 15 years of Sunday dinners had never achieved. Perhaps truth, however painful, created stronger bonds than the comfortable fictions we tell ourselves about perfect families. The remainder of that Sunday unfolded in a surreal blur. Helen, recovering her hostess instincts despite the circumstances, insisted on serving the meal for the children's sake. We sat around the table in a grotesque parody of our usual family dinner, picking at food no one wanted while attempting conversation no one felt equipped to maintain. Daniel barely touched his plate, his eyes frequently darting to Sophie and Ethan as if memorizing their features before an extended absence. The children, sensing the gravity of the situation despite our measured explanations, remained unusually subdued. Even Ethan, normally incapable of sitting still for more than 5 minutes, stayed quietly in his chair, occasionally reaching over to touch Daniel's arm, as if reassuring himself that his father hadn't disappeared yet. By unspoken agreement, we maintained the fiction of normalcy until dessert had been served and cleared. Then, with a composure I hadn't expected to maintain, I announced it was time for us to leave. "But Dad's coming home with us, right?" Ethan asked, panic edging his voice. "You said he'd stay at a hotel, but not tonight." "Not yet." Daniel and I exchanged glances. Another silent negotiation in an evening full of them. We hadn't discussed logistics. When he would leave, what he would take, how we would explain his absence to the neighbors and at school pickup. "Your dad needs to pack some things," I said finally. "He'll come home with us tonight to do that, and we can all talk more about the schedule and arrangements." The relief on both children's faces was palpable. Not a permanent reprieve, but a small extension. A chance to adjust gradually to the new reality, rather than having it thrust upon them without warning. As we prepared to leave, Helen pulled me aside while Daniel gathered the children's things. "I don't approve of how you handled this," she said, her voice low but intent. "There are proper ways to address marital problems, Rebecca. Private ways." I might have been stung by her criticism once, might have spent days replaying her words and questioning my decisions. But standing in her immaculate foyer, with the weight of months of deception finally lifted from my shoulders, I felt only a calm certainty. "I understand you're upset, Helen, but with respect, I'm not interested in proper anymore. I'm interested in honest. I'm interested in healthy. I'm interested in showing my children that self-respect matters more than appearances. Helen's lips thinned, but before she could respond, Richard appeared beside her. The children are in the car, he said to me, then turned to his wife. Helen, give Rebecca some space. This isn't easy for anyone. To my surprise, he then extended his hand to me, a formal gesture that nonetheless conveyed genuine respect. You have my support, for whatever that's worth. The children are lucky to have a mother with such clarity and strength. His words, so unexpected from the patriarch who had always seemed to value achievement over character, brought the first real crack in my composure. I accepted his handshake, not trusting myself to speak. The drive home was silent except for Ethan's occasional sniffles from the back seat. Daniel followed in his own car, a separation already beginning even as we maintained the appearance of returning home as a family unit. Once the children were settled in bed, a process that took longer than usual, with extra stories, reassurances, and promises about the future, Daniel and I found ourselves alone in the kitchen, where countless ordinary evenings had unfolded over 15 years. The mundane setting felt incongruous with the seismic shift in our relationship. I'll sleep in the guest room, he said, breaking the silence, and start looking for an apartment tomorrow. I nodded, the practical matters of separation temporarily overriding the emotional weight of the evening. When did you know? He asked suddenly. Not when did you suspect, but when did you know for certain? The question surprised me, less self-justification than I had expected, more genuine curiosity about when and how his carefully constructed deception had finally failed. The Sanderson Charity Gala, I answered after a moment's reflection. 3 months ago. You were across the room talking to Christina. I saw how you looked at her when you thought no one was watching. It wasn't the look of a mentor or colleague. It was the look you used to give me, in the beginning. Daniel winced, a flash of genuine regret crossing his features. I never meant for any of this to happen, he said quietly. That's the problem with lies, Daniel. They have a way of happening without conscious intent. One small deception leads to another, and another, until you're living a life you never actually chose but can't figure out how to escape. He looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. When did you get so wise? He asked, a hint of the admiration he'd once shown freely crossing his face. When I stopped believing the lies, I replied simply, both yours and my own. As Daniel climbed the stairs to pack an overnight bag for his first night away from home, I remained in the kitchen, allowing myself a moment of private grief for the marriage that had died long before tonight's public revelation. There was relief in the truth finally being spoken, but also sadness for what had been lost. The young couple we had once been, the family unit we had created, the future we had planned together. Yet beneath the grief lay something unexpected, a tentative sense of liberation. For months, I had carried the weight of knowing without saying, of seeing without acknowledging. That burden, at least, had been set down. Whatever challenges lay ahead, co-parenting, divorce proceedings, rebuilding a life independent of Daniel, I would face them without the corrosive presence of unspoken truths. The hotel receipt that had sparked tonight's confrontation still lay in my purse, its purpose now fulfilled. Tomorrow, I would shred it along with the other evidence I had accumulated, not to erase what had happened, but to signify that its power to hurt me had been neutralized by the light of truth. The weeks following what Sophie had taken to calling the Sunday unfolded with a strange mixture of pain and clarity. Daniel moved into a furnished apartment 10 minutes from our home, close enough to maintain his relationship with the children, but far enough to give me the space I needed to begin rebuilding my life. The legal process commenced with a sterile efficiency that belied the emotional complexity of dismantling 15 years of shared existence. My attorney, Jessica Winters, had been recommended by a colleague at the hospital where I worked part-time as a physical therapist. She specialized in high-asset divorces and had a reputation for tough but fair negotiations. He's offering a very generous settlement, Jessica noted during our third meeting, reviewing the proposal Daniel's attorney had submitted. More than the law would require, especially given Connecticut's equitable distribution standards. I wasn't surprised. Daniel's desire to avoid further public revelation of his infidelity, particularly at the firm where Christina still worked, gave me significant leverage. But more than that, I sensed a genuine remorse motivating his generosity. Not enough to save our marriage, but enough to acknowledge the harm he had caused. Is it fair? I asked, more concerned with that question than whether I could extract more. Jessica studied me with newfound respect. Yes, she confirmed. It's fair. The house, half his retirement accounts, substantial alimony until the children are in college, and child support above the statutory guidelines. You won't have to work unless you want to. I considered this, then nodded. Then let's accept it and focus on finalizing the custody arrangement. That's what matters most. The children were adjusting as well as could be expected, which is to say with a mixture of resilience and regression that sometimes left me marveling at their strength, and other times weeping quietly in the shower where they couldn't hear me. Sophie had appointed herself Ethan's protector, helping him pack his weekend bag for visits to Daniel's apartment and creating elaborate calendars to track when they would be with each parent. Ethan had developed a new bedtime ritual that involved calling Daniel every night, even on the days they had been with him, as if checking that his father still existed when not physically present. The child psychologist we had both agreed to consult assured us this was normal, a temporary coping mechanism that would fade as the new family structure became more familiar. 3 weeks after the Sunday, Helen called and asked to meet for coffee. I agreed with some trepidation, unsure what to expect from the woman who had always prioritized family image over individual well-being. We met at a small cafe halfway between our homes, neutral territory for what promised to be an uncomfortable conversation. Helen arrived precisely on time, impeccably dressed as always, though I noticed subtle signs of strain in the new lines around her eyes. "Thank you for meeting me," she began formally, her hands clasped around her teacup. "I owe you an apology." Of all the ways I had imagined this conversation beginning, an apology had not been among them. I remained silent, giving her space to continue. "I was wrong to criticize how you handled Daniel's indiscretions," she said, the euphemism clearly difficult for her to abandon even now. "Richard helped me see that my concern for appearances has sometimes come at the expense of truth and accountability." I nodded, acknowledging her words without immediately absolving her. "It hurt," I admitted, "to have you focus on how I revealed Daniel's betrayal rather than on the betrayal itself." Helen winced slightly, but didn't deny the accusation. "I've spent a lifetime believing that family problems should be handled privately. That public discussion of unpleasantness somehow magnifies it." She paused, seeming to choose her next words carefully. But Richard pointed out that my approach simply allowed problems to fester unaddressed, including perhaps patterns in how we raised Daniel. This was more insight than I had ever expected from Helen, whose self-reflection had always seemed limited to whether her dinner parties met the appropriate standards of elegance. "What does Richard think about all this?" I asked, genuinely curious about my father-in-law's perspective, which had surprised me during the confrontation. "He's deeply disappointed in Daniel," Helen admitted. "They've had several difficult conversations. Richard has always held integrity as his highest value, even when I've prioritized harmony." A rueful smile briefly crossed her face. 46 years of marriage, and we're still discovering these fundamental differences in our outlooks. Something in her tone made me look more closely at her. "How are you, Helen?" "Really?" The question seemed to catch her off guard, as if no one had asked about her welfare separate from the family's collective status in quite some time. "I'm struggling," she admitted, her perfect posture faltering slightly. "I built my identity around this ideal of family harmony. To have it fractured so publicly, to realize I may have contributed to the problems by emphasizing appearance over substance, it's been difficult to reconcile. For the first time in 15 years, I saw Helen not as Daniel's judgmental mother or as the intimidating family matriarch, but simply as a woman whose carefully constructed world had been upended, not unlike my own experience. "The children would love to see you," I offered, surprising myself with the genuine invitation. The situation is hard enough without losing connections to extended family. Tears gathered in Helen's perfectly made-up eyes. "I wasn't sure you'd want me in their lives," she confessed, "given how I reacted that night. You're their grandmother," I said simply, "and they need all the love and stability they can get right now." As we finished our coffee and made plans for Helen to visit the children that weekend, I realized that the Sunday had precipitated changes far beyond my marriage. Ripple effects touching every relationship connected to our family unit. Some of those changes were painful, others unexpectedly positive, but all of them were necessary consequences of bringing truth into the open. 6 months after the Sunday, life had settled into new patterns that were beginning to feel, if not normal, at least sustainable. The divorce had been finalized with less acrimony than many of my friends had experienced, thanks in part to Daniel's guilt-motivated generosity, and in part to my own determination to prioritize the children's well-being over punitive impulses. The custody arrangement, weekdays with me, weekends with Daniel, and flexible adjustments for special events, was working reasonably well. The children had stopped asking when Dad was coming home and had begun referring to Mom's house and Dad's apartment, with matter-of-fact acceptance that signaled their adaptation to the new reality. I had returned to work full-time at the hospital, finding unexpected satisfaction in the increased professional responsibility. The physical therapy practice had offered me a partnership track, something I might never have considered when my identity was primarily defined by my role as Daniel's wife and the children's mother. It was on a crisp October afternoon, almost exactly a year after I had found the first concrete evidence of Daniel's infidelity, that I encountered Christina Lawson at the grocery store. I had seen her only once before in person, at the Sanderson Charity Gala, where I had recognized the nature of her relationship with my husband. Now she stood frozen in the produce section, a basket of vegetables suspended mid-selection as she registered my presence. For a moment, we simply stared at each other. Two women connected by circumstances neither of us had anticipated when our paths first crossed. I had imagined this encounter many times over the past year, rehearsing cutting remarks or dignified dismissals, but standing there among the organic kale and heirloom tomatoes, those practiced responses felt suddenly irrelevant. "Rebecca," she acknowledged finally, her voice barely audible over the store's background music. "Christina," I replied, surprised by the steadiness of my own voice. An awkward silence expanded between us, filled with unspoken histories and questions. She looked younger than I remembered, more uncertain, her professional confidence replaced by evident discomfort. "I heard you and Daniel finalized the divorce," she said eventually, a statement that revealed both ongoing contact with my ex-husband and awareness of our legal proceedings. "Yes, 3 months ago," I confirmed, finding myself oddly calm in this surreal exchange. Christina shifted her weight, clearly struggling with what to say next. "I know it doesn't mean anything, but I'm sorry for my role in everything." The apology, however inadequate, seemed genuine, not a defensive justification or an attempt to minimize her actions, but a simple acknowledgement of harm caused. "Are you still together?" I asked, the question emerging before I had fully decided to voice it. Christina's expression confirmed the answer before she spoke. "No, it ended shortly after that Sunday dinner. He said he needed to focus on rebuilding his relationship with his children." I nodded, absorbing this information without the satisfaction I might once have expected to feel. Daniel's pattern of prioritizing his own needs, whether pursuing an affair or ending it, remained consistent, even if the specific decisions had changed. "I hope you find someone who isn't married next time," I said finally, the words direct, but delivered without malice. A flush of shame colored Christina's cheeks, but she met my gaze directly. "I deserved that," she acknowledged, "and much worse." As I moved to continue my shopping, Christina spoke again. "He wasn't unhappy with you, you know. That's what I told myself at first, that I was filling some void in his life. But he talked about you with respect, with admiration. The affair wasn't about you lacking something. It was about him." I paused, considering whether this information was meant to comfort me or absolve her. Perhaps both. Either way, it confirmed what months of therapy had helped me recognize. Daniel's betrayal had been a reflection of his character, not my worth. "I know," I said simply, and continued down the aisle, leaving Christina and the conversation behind. That evening, as I prepared dinner while helping Sophie with her algebra homework and periodically checking on Ethan's progress with his science project, my phone buzzed with a text from Daniel. He was running late for his scheduled call with the children. A partner meeting had gone longer than expected. A year ago, such a message would have triggered immediate suspicion, a mental calculation of whether his explanation matched known facts, an instinctive check of his location on our family tracking app. Now, I simply adjusted the evening schedule, letting the children know their call with Dad would be a bit later than planned. The change wasn't due to renewed trust in Daniel. Our relationship as co-parents required practical cooperation, but not the intimate faith marriage had demanded. Rather, the change was in me. I no longer felt compelled to verify others' truths or manage their choices. I had learned painfully but definitively that I could survive betrayal, speak uncomfortable truths, and rebuild a life authentic to my own values. As I stirred the pasta sauce, watching Sophie frown over a particularly challenging equation, I found myself smiling at the ordinary perfection of the moment. Not the curated perfection Helen had always strived for, but the authentic contentment of being present in a life aligned with truth, however messy and imperfect that truth might be. The hotel receipt that had catalyzed our family's transformation was long gone, shredded along with the other evidence I had accumulated. But its impact remained, not as an artifact of betrayal, but as the catalyst for a freedom I might never have found without the courage to speak the truth, whatever the consequences. 2 years after the Sunday, I stood in the back of a crowded university auditorium, watching Sophie accept a writing award for her personal essay titled "When Truth Shatters, Finding Strength Through Family Upheaval." At 14, my daughter had transformed her experience of our family's dissolution into a powerful meditation on honesty, resilience, and the complexity of adult relationships that had earned her statewide recognition. Daniel sat 3 rows ahead, Ethan beside him, both of them beaming with pride as Sophie approached the podium. We no longer attended such events as a unified family, but we had developed a functional co-parenting relationship that allowed us to celebrate our children's achievements without tension overshadowing their moments of triumph. As Sophie began her acceptance speech, I found myself reflecting on how profoundly the Sunday had altered all our trajectories. The children, after the initial pain of adjustment, had developed a remarkable emotional intelligence and capacity for nuance that many of their peers lacked. They understood that people could make serious mistakes without being villains, that relationships could end without love being entirely absent. That truth, however difficult, was ultimately less damaging than comfortable deception. My mother taught me the most important lesson of my life 2 years ago, Sophie was saying, her poised delivery belying her youth. Not through lectures or rules, but through example. She showed me that speaking truth, even when it's painful, even when it disrupts everything you thought was stable, is an act of courage and self-respect. From my position at the back, I could see Daniel's shoulders tense slightly at these words. Our daughter wasn't being deliberately cruel. She maintained a close relationship with her father despite full awareness of his role in our divorce. But she had inherited my commitment to unvarnished truth. My father taught me about redemption, Sophie continued, balancing her narrative with characteristic fairness. About owning mistakes, accepting consequences, and working every day to rebuild trust and connection. Together, my parents showed me that the end of a marriage doesn't have to mean the end of family, just its transformation into something different but equally valuable. As applause followed her speech, I quietly exited the auditorium, needing a moment alone to process the complex emotions her words had evoked. I found a quiet corner in the lobby, taking deep breaths to steady myself before the reception that would follow the ceremony. "She's remarkable," a voice said behind me. I turned to find Richard, Daniel's father, approaching with a program in hand. "Gets her clarity from you, I think. And her fairness from you," I acknowledged, genuinely pleased to see him. Over the past 2 years, Richard had maintained a close relationship with the children and, surprisingly, with me as well. We had developed a friendship independent of his son, bonded by shared values and mutual respect that had never fully blossomed during my marriage. "Daniel struggles with her perception of events," Richard noted, his tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. "He wants to be her hero, not her cautionary tale. She loves him," I said simply, "but she sees him clearly. That's a gift, even if it doesn't feel like one to him right now." Richard nodded, understanding implicit in his expression. At 72, he had developed a philosophical perspective on family dynamics that his younger self might have found uncomfortably introspective. "Helen wanted me to ask if you'd join us for dinner next Sunday," he said, changing the subject. "She's trying that new Mediterranean diet and wants guinea pigs for her olive tapenade." I smiled at the invitation, no longer surprised by the unexpected ways relationships had reconfigured in the aftermath of divorce. Helen and I would never be intimate friends, but we had developed a functional cordiality centered around our shared love for Sophie and Ethan. "I'd like that," I accepted. "Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," Richard replied. "And perhaps your young man, if he's available." The reference to James, the hospital administrator I had been dating for the past 6 months, was delivered with a casualness that still occasionally caught me off guard. The Peterson family's ability to acknowledge my post-divorce life without drama or recrimination represented personal growth I hadn't anticipated during those early, painful months of separation. "I'll check his schedule," I promised, warmth spreading through me at the thought of James, whose straightforward nature and inherent trustworthiness had gradually helped heal wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. As attendees began filtering out of the auditorium, Richard patted my shoulder gently. "I'll see you at the reception. And Rebecca, I'm proud of the family we've all managed to become, despite everything. Different, as Sophie said, but valuable nonetheless." His words echoed my daughter's assessment, affirming the unexpected truth we had all discovered. that family could be redefined, that connections could survive radical transformation, that authenticity, however disruptive initially, ultimately created stronger foundations than convenient fictions ever could. When Sophie emerged from the auditorium, award in hand and eyes searching the crowd for her parents, I watched as she spotted first Daniel and Ethan, then me, her face lighting with the uncomplicated joy of a child who knows she is loved, despite the complicated history of the adults in her life. In that moment, I knew with absolute certainty that the pain of the Sunday had been worth enduring, not just for my own liberation from a marriage built on deception, but for the authentic relationships that had emerged from its ashes. Relationships grounded in truth, resilient enough to withstand discomfort, and ultimately more nurturing than the perfect family portrait we had once presented to the world. 5 years to the day after the Sunday, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a light-filled craftsman bungalow I had purchased the previous spring, arranging appetizers for what had become a tradition none of us could have imagined in the aftermath of that fateful dinner, the annual Truth Day gathering. Sophie, now 17 and applying to colleges with a confidence that sometimes took my breath away, had instituted the tradition on the first anniversary of the divorce. "We should acknowledge it," she had declared with the wisdom that occasionally made me forget she was still a child. "Not pretend it didn't happen, but recognize how it changed all of us. Maybe even find things to be grateful for." What had begun as a small gathering, just the children, Daniel and me sharing an awkward meal and halting reflections, had gradually expanded to include key figures in our reconstructed family constellation. This year, the guest list included Helen and Richard, Daniel's brother Mark and his wife Jen, James, who had recently become my fiancé, and even Daniel's current girlfriend Meredith, a divorce attorney he had met through professional circles, whose own experience with marriage dissolution had given her a sensitivity that made her an unexpectedly positive presence in the children's lives. The doorbell rang, and Ethan, now 15 and nearly as tall as his father, bounded down the stairs to answer it. "Grandpa's here," he called, his voice cracking with the adolescent changes that still caught me by surprise. Richard entered carrying a bottle of wine and a small wrapped package. At 75, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind remained sharp and his eyes alert as he surveyed the preparations. "Helen's running late," he explained, handing me the wine. "Some crisis with the flower arrangements for next week's charity luncheon." I smiled, accepting both the wine and the explanation. Some things hadn't changed. Helen's commitment to perfect presentations remained unwavering, even as her definition of family had expanded to accommodate new realities. "And this," Richard said, presenting the wrapped package to me, "is just a small token, for what it's worth." Curious, I unwrapped the gift to find a handsome leather-bound journal with my initials embossed on the cover. Inside, a handwritten note read simply, "For recording truths, both difficult and beautiful. With admiration, Richard." The thoughtfulness of the gesture, acknowledging the value of truth-telling that had defined our reconstructed family dynamic, brought unexpected emotion to the surface. "Thank you," I said simply, knowing Richard would understand the depth of gratitude conveyed in those 2 words. As the house gradually filled with guests, Daniel and Meredith arriving with dessert, Sophie's boyfriend joining us for the first time, Mark and Jen bringing their new baby, I found myself observing the interactions with a sense of wonder. These people, connected by both blood and choice, had created something remarkable from the ashes of deception and confrontation. James appeared at my side, slipping an arm around my waist. "You okay?" he asked quietly, attuned as always to the subtle shifts in my emotional state. I nodded, leaning into his solid presence, just reflecting on how far we've all come. He followed my gaze to where Daniel was showing Richard something on his phone, their heads bent together in comfortable conversation. "It's not the family you planned on," James observed, "but it's a good one nonetheless." The simple truth of his assessment settled around me like a comfortable shawl. Not the family I had planned, certainly. Not the life I had envisioned when standing before friends and family exchanging vows with Daniel 16 years earlier, but a life of authenticity and hard-won wisdom that I wouldn't trade for the illusion of perfection I had once so carefully maintained. When Sophie called everyone to the table, I took my place at the head, no longer the wife fulfilling prescribed duties, but the architect of my own reconfigured life. Daniel sat at the opposite end, Meredith beside him, the children between us like bridges connecting separate but related territories. "Before we eat," Sophie announced, assuming her self-appointed role as facilitator, "we have our traditional moment of acknowledgement. Would anyone like to begin?" To my surprise, it was Daniel who spoke first. 5 years ago today, I was forced to confront the consequences of choices I had made. Choices that hurt people I loved and fractured the family we had built. His voice was steady, his gaze direct as it moved from Sophie to Ethan to me. I will always regret the pain I caused, but I've come to be grateful for the honesty that eventually emerged from it. We're all more authentic with each other now than we ever were during our marriage. He raised his glass slightly. To Rebecca, whose courage in speaking truth, however painful at the time, ultimately gave all of us the chance to build something real. The acknowledgement, delivered without defensiveness or residual resentment, represented a level of personal growth I would never have anticipated during those raw early days of separation. I nodded my acceptance of his words, recognizing them not as absolution, but as evidence of the genuine transformation the Sunday had catalyzed in all of us. As others offered their reflections, Richard's thoughtful observations about family resilience, Helen's careful acknowledgement of growth in her own perspective, Sophie's characteristic wisdom about truth's double-edged nature, I felt a sense of completion settle over me. The hotel receipt that had once represented betrayal and deception had initiated a cascade of truths that had ultimately freed us all from the constraints of appearances and expectations. 5 years after the Sunday, the envelope of truth had delivered not just the end of a marriage built on deception, but the beginning of a life anchored in authenticity, a transformation worth every moment of pain it had required. 7 years after the Sunday, I stood in the back of another university auditorium, this time watching Sophie prepare to deliver her valedictory address at her college graduation. At 19, she had accelerated through her undergraduate studies with the same determination and clarity she brought to everything, earning top honors while majoring in psychology with a focus on family systems. James stood beside me, his steady presence a comfort as always. We had married 2 years earlier in a simple ceremony at our home, with Sophie and Ethan serving as our attendants and our reconstructed family constellation filling the garden. Daniel had attended with Meredith, whom he had married the previous year, their mutual experience with failed first marriages, creating a foundation of realistic expectations and honest communication that seemed to serve them well. "She looks nervous," James observed as Sophie adjusted her cap on the stage where graduates were assembling. "She is," Ethan confirmed from my other side. At 17, he had grown into a perceptive young man with his father's analytical mind and a compassion that was uniquely his own. She rewrote her speech 4 times, says she wants to honor the truth without making anyone uncomfortable. The delicate balance he described, honesty without unnecessary harm, had become something of a family value in the years since the Sunday, a principle all of us, in our different ways, had learned to navigate. When Sophie stepped to the podium after the introductions, her poised demeanor betrayed only the slightest tension in her shoulders, visible perhaps only to those who knew her best. "Distinguished faculty, honored guests, fellow graduates," she began, her voice clear and confident. "We gather today to celebrate academic achievement, but the most valuable education rarely happens in classrooms. My most important lesson began 7 years ago at a Sunday dinner, when my mother chose truth over comfort, authenticity over appearance, and in doing so, taught me the most enduring value of all, that integrity sometimes requires disruption." In the audience, I felt rather than saw Daniel shift in his seat several rows ahead. Not with discomfort, but with the attentive recognition that our daughter was once again processing our family history through her own lens. "Many of you know the outlines of my family's story," Sophie continued. "It's formed the foundation of my academic interest in how families navigate truth and transformation. What you may not know is how that moment of painful honesty ultimately created something stronger than what it broke." She paused, her gaze sweeping the audience with remarkable poise for someone her age. "My father taught me that good people can make devastating mistakes, and that redemption requires not just apology, but sustained effort to rebuild what trust was broken. My mother showed me that speaking truth, even when it shatters comfort, is an act of courage rather than cruelty." Together, though no longer married, they demonstrated that family bonds can transform rather than terminate when facades fall away. As Sophie continued her address, weaving personal experience into broader observations about authenticity in an age of carefully curated social media personas, I felt a profound sense of completion. The hotel receipt that had catalyzed our family's transformation had long since been destroyed, but its impact continued to ripple through our lives in ways I could never have anticipated on that rainy night when I first discovered it. The crisis that might have broken us beyond repair had instead forced a reckoning with truth that ultimately freed us all. from the constraints of appearances, from the burden of unspoken knowledge, from the limitations of roles defined by others' expectations. When the ceremony concluded and we gathered for photographs, a configuration that now included James and Meredith, alongside Daniel and me, with Helen and Richard beaming proudly at their granddaughter's achievement, I marveled at the family we had become, not despite the Sunday, but because of it. Not through avoiding painful truths, but through facing them directly, with courage and eventual grace. "Penny for your thoughts," James murmured as the photographer arranged us in various groupings, the easy coordination of current and former spouses, step-parents and grandparents presenting no apparent challenge to anyone. "I was just thinking about envelopes," I replied enigmatically. He raised an eyebrow, familiar with my occasional philosophical tangents, but clearly not following this one. 7 years ago, I put a hotel receipt in a blue envelope, never imagining how completely it would change all our lives, I explained. It ended my marriage, but it began this. I gestured to the gathered family, connected now by choice rather than just obligation or legal ties. James nodded, understanding dawning. The envelope of truth. Exactly, I agreed. Painful to open, but ultimately liberating. As Sophie joined us, radiant in her accomplishment, she overheard the end of our exchange. "Are you two getting philosophical about envelopes?" she teased, her intuitive grasp of context requiring no further explanation. "Your mother is waxing poetic about truth and consequences," James confirmed with affectionate amusement. Sophie's expression softened into something both wise and tender. "Well, she's earned the right," she said simply, linking her arm through mine. "Some people spend their whole lives avoiding difficult truths. Mom had the courage to face one head-on, not knowing where it would lead." As we moved toward the reception, surrounded by the family we had all chosen to become, I realized that Sophie had articulated precisely what had changed in me since that Sunday dinner 7 years earlier. I had learned to trust truth's path, however uncomfortable or uncertain it might initially appear. To recognize that authenticity, while sometimes disruptive in the moment, ultimately creates foundations far stronger than the most carefully maintained facades. The envelope of truth had indeed changed everything, not by destroying what was precious, but by revealing what was real. And in that reality, painful as its emergence had been, we had all found a freedom worth every moment of the journey. 10 years after the Sunday, I sat on the patio of my home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of amber and rose. The garden, which had become my passion project in recent years, stretched before me in well-tended beds of perennials and flowering shrubs, plants that returned year after year, their cycles of dormancy and bloom a reminder that renewal often follows periods of apparent death. James appeared from the kitchen, carrying 2 glasses of wine and settling into the chair beside mine. "They're on their way," he confirmed, referring to the gathering that would soon fill our home. Daniel texted that they're running about 15 minutes late, something about Meredith's mother needing a last-minute ride. I nodded, unsurprised by the update. These casual communications about logistics, the peaceful coordination between current and former spouses that now characterized our extended family dynamic, had become so routine that it was easy to forget how remarkable they might appear to outsiders. "Did you finish your remarks?" James asked, gesturing to the notebook in my lap. "Just about," I confirmed, though it feels strange to be so formal about it. 10 years seems both momentous and arbitrary at the same time. He smiled, understanding as always. Some anniversaries deserve acknowledgement, even unconventional ones. He was right, of course. The 10th anniversary of the Sunday had taken on a significance that transcended its painful origins. What had begun as Sophie's insistence that we acknowledge, rather than avoid the pivotal moment in our family history, had evolved into a meaningful tradition of reflection and gratitude for the authentic connections that had emerged from that crucible. The sound of car doors and voices announced the arrival of the first guests. Ethan, home from his sophomore year at college, emerged from the house to greet his father and stepmother. At 20, he had grown into a thoughtful young man whose early fear of family dissolution had transformed into a remarkable capacity for navigating complex relationships, a skill he attributed directly to the lessons of the Sunday and its aftermath. As more cars arrived and our home filled with the reconstructed family constellation that had formed around the children, Daniel and Meredith, Helen and Richard, Mark and Jen and their now school-aged children, Sophie and her fiancé Matthew, friends who had supported us through the difficult early days of separation, I found myself observing the easy interactions with a sense of wonder that had never fully faded. When everyone had assembled in the garden with plates of food and glasses of wine, Sophie naturally assumed her role as facilitator of the gathering. 10 years ago today, she began, her voice carrying the quiet authority that had characterized her since childhood. Our family experienced what Mom now calls the envelope of truth, a moment that shattered the image we presented to the world and forced us to confront reality, however painful. Murmurs of acknowledgement circled the gathering. There was no discomfort in this recollection now, no raw edges of hurt or defensiveness, just the shared recognition of a defining moment that had shaped all our trajectories. We gather each year not to dwell on past hurts, but to acknowledge how truth, even when it arrives in devastating packaging, ultimately creates more authentic connections than comfortable deceptions ever could, Sophie continued. Mom, would you share your thoughts on this 10th anniversary? I hadn't planned to speak first, but I accepted the invitation, opening the notebook where I had gathered my reflections. 10 years ago, I began. I sat at Helen's dining room table with a blue envelope in my purse, terrified of the consequences of revealing what it contained, yet more afraid of continuing to live with unacknowledged truth. I couldn't have imagined then where that moment of courage, or desperation, or perhaps both, would ultimately lead us. I looked around at the gathered faces, each representing a relationship that had been tested, transformed, or in some cases created by the aftermath of that confrontation. I expected truth to bring endings, and it did. My marriage ended. The family structure the children had known ended. The narrative I had constructed about my life ended. But what I didn't understand then was how those endings would create space for beginnings I couldn't have imagined. Daniel nodded from across the circle, his expression reflective rather than defensive. The man who had once betrayed my trust had become, somewhat improbably, one of the most honest people in my life. The hard lessons of the Sunday having catalyzed a personal reckoning that transformed him as profoundly as it had changed me. If I could go back to that Sunday, I continued, knowing everything that would follow, the pain and the healing, the loss and the discovery, the endings and the beginnings, I would still choose truth. Not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Not because it protected us from hurt, but because it ultimately led us to authenticity. As others shared their reflections, Helen's acknowledgement of how the crisis had forced her to reconsider her lifelong prioritization of appearances over substance. Richard's observations about how adversity reveals character. Sophie's insights about the family system we had ultimately created. I felt a profound sense of completion. The hotel receipt that had once represented betrayal and deception had initiated a cascade of truth-telling that had ultimately freed us all, not just from the specific lies of that moment, but from the broader constraints of expectations and appearances that had limited our authentic connection. 10 years after the Sunday, the envelope of truth had delivered its final and most meaningful message. That honesty, however disruptive in the moment, creates foundations far stronger than deception ever could. And on those foundations, we had built something none of us could have imagined on that painful night. A family defined not by legal ties or social expectations, but by the conscious choice to remain connected through truth, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. What a powerful journey we've taken today, from that tense moment at the family dinner table to the beautiful, reconstructed family that emerged 10 years later. Rebecca's story reminds us that sometimes the most difficult truths can ultimately lead to our greatest freedom and most authentic connections. Have you ever experienced a moment when revealing a difficult truth changed everything? Or perhaps you've been on the receiving end of a painful revelation that ultimately led to personal growth? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more explorations of relationship challenges, personal growth, and the transformative power of truth. Each week, we share stories that remind us of our shared humanity and capacity for resilience. Next week, we'll be diving into another emotional journey about forgiveness and second chances that I believe will touch your heart just as deeply. Don't forget to like this video and hit that notification bell so you never miss our new uploads. Your engagement helps our community grow and allows us to continue bringing these meaningful narratives to life. Thank you for joining me today. Remember, truth may not always be comfortable, but as Rebecca discovered, it's ultimately the only path to authentic connection and personal freedom. Until next time.